Hello. I'm going to talk about the Sermon on the Mount. Now, to a lot of like progressive Christians and to a lot of red letter Christians and to several liberal Christians and such who have emphasized more the teachings of Jesus, the Sermon on the Mount has kind of been, in some ways, the equivalent to the resurrection. Or the Sermon on the Mount has kind of been the big center of Christianity. And I definitely have to say I do love the Sermon on the Mount. I think that's some great stuff. It's a great sermon. However, I myself actually don't think of it as the center of Christianity. And it's missing things like the parable of the prodigal son. It's missing, and there's a lot of stuff in the Gospel of Thomas that it's missing, and in the Gospel of Thomas is another thing that some Christians have started to make kind of the center of Christianity for them. And I'm going to say, well, the Gospel of Thomas is missing some of the things that are in the Sermon on the Mount, and both of them are missing things like the parable of the Good Samaritan. So, I have to say, I definitely don't think the Sermon on the Mount should be thought of as the center of all Christianity. I'm not sure if there really should be one thing that Christianity is completely based off of. Or I guess the teachings of Jesus, but well, that's a given. But one little part of the Bible or one little part of this or that. And that's my first point. My second point, or my second comment, is I don't think the Sermon on the Mount actually happened. People now are like dropping their jaws shocked. Now, the Sermon on the Mount is only in the Gospel of Matthew. And the Gospel of Matthew is, well, let me put it like this. Around the beginning of the Gospel of Matthew, Jesus, as a baby, is taken to Egypt. And while he's a baby in Egypt, the king wants all the babies killed, but Jesus is the baby that escapes. There's a story similar to that in Exodus about Moses. Then in the Gospel of Matthew, Jesus spends some time out in the wilderness and alone. Moses kind of has some similar experiences. And then the Sermon on the Mount is Jesus preaching about God, or talking about God, or talking about the law from the top of a mountain. Sounds kind of like Moses giving the Ten Commandments. So, scholars have concluded that the Gospel of Matthew was possibly trying to retell the story of Moses, making it about Jesus. And the authors they went back to the Gospel of Mark, and most of the other part of the Gospel of Matthew is very much basically the Gospel of Mark again, except adding more sort of emphasis on Judaism, the Jewish law. And yeah, the Gospel of Mark was most likely written to have stories about Jesus during part of the Jewish year, sort of to read in the synagogue or in the temple. But Mark only covered part of the year, so Matthew was written as sort of to have a full year, to have stories about Jesus that cover the whole year. And Luke was also likely written for that reason, and Luke also goes back to Mark, but Luke isn't as loyal to Mark as Matthew is. And Luke was written for a more universalist, or the more universalist equivalent temple, and Matthew was written for a very orthodox synagogue. But I really, I have to say, the Sermon on the Mount is great. Has some great stuff. And I'm also going to comment that much of what's in the Sermon on the Mount are things that biblical scholars and biblical historians have concluded that are very likely that Jesus himself actually said in his life. And, and of course, they're likely to be like paraphrases, and that's basically probably what most of the things are. And the same could probably be said about many of the Greek philosophers who existed before Jesus, but in Greece and so on. But overall, I have to say, I think the Sermon on the Mount is fantastic, but I don't believe it actually happened, and I don't think it to be the center of Christianity. However, I do think it has great meaning, and I do believe that Jesus gave a lot of sermons, probably, possibly maybe the sermon in the house, the sermon in the temple, but he might have given a sermon from a mountain, but the Sermon on the Mount was probably written more for liturgical purposes and not to be thought of as a historical event. Thank you for watching. Shalom.